Thanks everyone for joining. When I decided to do the webinar specifically to talk about instructors and grandfathering in employees, I wasn't sure what the response would be, and I've been pretty busy working with customers on the initial training programs. We noticed that not everybody had started the grandfathering in process. This would be a way of getting everybody a jump start on that part of the 243 compliance. My intent is that we'll just go through these two requirements, and then from a practical aspect, I just want to show you how to do those in Railtasker. With that, I'm going to get started. For today's webinar, I'm going to focus first on designating employees and then on the designated instructors. And I always say when you see the word designated in 243, that just means you're going to have a list somewhere. So there's some sort of documentation, because as an employer, whether you're a railroad or contractor, you'll want to make sure that you can provide that list to FRA if it were to be asked. It's nothing you need to submit, it's just for your internal record keeping. Designating employees, this was early on in the regulation called grandfathering in, which was the language we also used for 242 with the conductor certification. But according to FRA, designating a safety-related employee is when the employer, meaning the organization, the railroad, or the contractor, declares which occupational categories its employees belong to. That's just to keep in mind. We're doing this at the occupational category level, which I have a screen in a minute to show you what that looks like. And I know that we have probably about half and half of people here that use Railtasker and others of you that do not. So I'll try to provide examples of what that looks like for these, or I'll talk to the associations programs as well. And then it just talks through the whole federal railroad safety laws, regulations, and orders, which is part of that definition of what a safety-related task is for Part 243. Basically everything FRA governs with the exception of hazardous materials. When you're designating employees, a couple things to keep in mind. They need to have been qualified to meet the criteria to be grandfathered in prior to May 1st. If they weren't trained on these things prior to May 1st, or they're a new hire or new promotion, they would need to be trained per your 243 initial training programs you submitted to FRA. And the employers have until the end of this year to create its documentation. I know that the association has an Excel template to help you if you use their templates, and I'll show you. And for our customers, we customized your job categories based on your operations. I'll give you an example of what that can look like. And if you're using a learning management system, you certainly can do this to track who is grandfathered in your LMS, and Railtasker does this as well. The only thing I would caution you, if you're using an LMS other than Railtasker, I don't know if that's the case, but I just want to point out, you want to grandfather them in the system in a way that shows that they didn't actually take the course. For example, when I was working with the Class 1s with success factors, we changed the completion status, from complete or pass to designated, and that's exactly what shows in Railtasker as well. I think you just need to be able to add a note or something that clarifies that they're being grandfathered in versus them showing that they actually took and complete the course. With that said, one of the options with grandfathering in employees is that you can have them take the course or complete a checklist without the repetitions. That is an option, but it is not a requirement. The other thing I want to mention is that you can, while you're grandfathering people in, FRA will expect to see training records on training requirements that were already in place to the degree that the regulation requires. For example, you'll need record keeping training records on your certifications like you always have, on-track safety. When you're talking about Part 232 brake safety standards, you know, that has a hands-on component. Those are all things that need to be done regardless. This is slightly different. This is grandfathering them into those job categories you created for 243. And feel free to chat in questions if you have any. The other thing, I was just talking to someone this morning about this, is the railroad crane operator training requirement, or roadway maintenance machines equipped with a crane in Part 214. This is one that you would not be able to grandfather people in because that training requirement actually went into effect at the start of 2015. You should have a hands-on training program and documentation for that prior to today, or prior to May 1st. And if you don't, certainly we have that program. You can use ours if you're a customer. Reach out if you're interested otherwise, but the truth is I just want to get them trained up on that requirement if you don't have those records. Let's see. Talking about documentation, as an example, I have a template of what we put together for a lot of people, and if this doesn't look familiar to you and you're one of our customers, we did a combination of providing Word documents. Sometimes we just went through and did a spreadsheet, so it looks similar to the bottom portion here, but there was the course names on the left instead of employees. Either way, whatever your 243 plan looks like, and I think the association has it by CFR part because that's how their submissions are laid out. But you'll want to categorize your employees based on these red headings of however we created those groupings. If you have a maintenance away laborer as a job title, or maybe you have track supervisor, track inspector, whatever was created specific to your organization. Again, if you're using the association templates, you likely you may have not put people into categories, you may have just done it by CFR parts. You would have the CFR parts across the top. And then to designate employees, simply have their names. It's just demo data for X to show you what it could look like, and then an X. If you're saying that Josh Johnson is a mechanical manager, then whatever was listed, all the courses required to become a mechanical manager, he's being grandfathered into that 243 curriculum path. Hopefully that makes sense for you all. I'm not seeing any questions yet on it, so I'm gonna take that as that sounds good. Let's see here. I'm gonna go back one more time on one thing. For Rail Tasker, when there's an OJT checklist within it, and usually is curriculum paths end with OJT or have one or two OJT components, that's what I'm gonna show you how to do in the app in a moment here. Before I show you the grandfathering in, I also wanted to talk about designating instructors. This is the other piece to make sure from a record keeping now that we're after May 1st. The definition in 243 is what's on the screen. It's a person designated by the employer or training organization who, there's two sides to this definition: demonstrated to the training program submitted to FRA, adequate knowledge to the subject matter under instruction, and when applicable has the necessary experience to effectively provide formal training of the subject matter. They need to have demonstrated knowledge and have, as applicable, the necessary experience for formal training. Now, in practicality, for having designated instructors, really as an employer, you just need to deem that they're qualified. Certainly, they would need to have the same kind of training and background as the topics they're training. They do not need to be craft qualified. For example, somebody who's not a Carmen could teach Carmen about blue signal protection as long as they're rules qualified. They don't need to be craft qualified to the topics that they're training. And I think I have one more slide on designated instructors. They're used, if you look at the top half, designated instructors are the people who would be in the front of the classroom delivering classroom training. They also are required to do that final sign-off for OJT and hands-on training. And you should have a list of who your instructors are, in my opinion. From a true record-keeping perspective, it really comes into play more specifically on that on-the-job training checklist. But I think in best practice, I would have a list of who your instructors are and what they teach. A little above and beyond, but I think it would be a good practice. And then I just have on the same slide the difference, so you can see the difference between qualified people, which is not a definition in the regulation, I don't think, but comes up in the compliance manual and in some of the other guidance FRA has issued. This is the peer trainer. They cannot do the final sign off on the job training checklist, but they can sign off in the repetitions. I like to use conductors as an example. You have a conductor trainee working with a peer trainer, another conductor, another crew, and that conductor is gonna evaluate the trainee over the course of the day or shift on some of the tasks that were performed. But then you have a train master, DSLE, who falls under the bucket of designated instructor that will do the final sign off. And I have documented by training records here. All that means is that a qualified person is a qualified person because they've also completed that training, and that's the only requirement. You don't have a list, you have a training record that shows that so-and-so is a conductor or so-and-so is completed or grandfathered in would be sufficient into that occupational category. My main goal was to make sure you guys understood the record keeping pieces as it came to these two requirements. When we talk about OJT records, this is where having that designated instructor is important from truly what is required by 243. So on your on-the-job training records, you need to have the unique name and identifier for the program, the date it was successfully completed. You might have other dates where they were practicing, but then a final sign-off date. And then the last is the person, the identification of the person who did that final sign-off. And earlier in the regulation, it says it has to be a designated instructor. And so that's where that comes into play. These are my last slides before I jump into Railtasker specifically. Before I do that, I'm happy to open it up. We are just 15 minutes pretty much after the hour, and I really just want to show how these apply in Railtasker for those of you using it and answer any questions on the technical side. But I should maybe be careful what I'm saying here, but any questions on these two topics or just anything in general with 243, I'm happy to answer. So feel free to chat those in if you have any burning questions. And looking at the list of folks, I recognize most of your names, if not almost all of them. I'll just say there's a few people I don't recognize. If for any reason somebody has not yet submitted their 243 programs, I would just suggest you do that soon. I would say sooner rather than later. And if you have any questions on that or there's a reason you're stuck, feel free to reach out. Let's see if I can switch from PowerPoint to Railtasker. Most of you who are working with Railtasker, I think, have gotten into the learning management system. Diana, and I think we tend to start with getting people up and running here, and we see a lot of activity on this side of the system. As a reminder, you also have the app where the operations tests are and these 243 checklists. And because the 243 checklists are on this side, that also means that's where our record keeping is when it comes to on-the-job training. So there's detailed record keeping within Railtasker, excuse me, that I want to show you. For those of you using Railtasker, and I'll just pick, I should have picked some ahead of time. When you go to the checklist side and then go to checklists, you pick the checklist that you're looking at. I'll pick one with some trainees here. Where'd my roadway maintenance machine operator go? Within the checklist, it will show up who the qualified people are just because they completed the checklist. The other thing is that it will also keep a list of your designated instructors. For those reasons, you can just, if you need to add an instructor, you turn the toggle off and you can assign somebody as an instructor, and it's as simple as that. And of course, for those of you using Railtasker, that just gives them the right permissions, but it also manages that from a 243 perspective. And then once you have your list of instructors, you can export that to the CSV file if you were to ever need it. Now, to grandfather somebody in the app is also fairly straightforward. We'll look at Ben here. He's not grandfathered into anything. When you're looking at a specific person, you can designate a checklist to them, which is the same as grandfathering them into that requirement for 243. So you would just pick the checklist, say he should be grandfathered in as a Carmen. And that includes for those, that's the last item in our Carmen curriculum path. So that's how we're documenting that he's being grandfathered in as a Carmen. And so when you look at those Word documents with all those curriculum paths, generally they end with an OJT checklist. There might be a couple examples that may not, but that Excel spreadsheet template that I showed you would suffice to also keep that on hand. And for those of you that have been working with us, Diane's on the call right now, so I'm going to volunteer her and myself will happily get that template put together for you. I know there's a couple of you on the call that I owe that to. So we'll happily get you started on that based on what we put together for your plan, and then you can plug in your people and complete that, send it back to us, and we'll do the work of grandfathering in it here, although I just want you to know you certainly can do that on your own, as I just showed you here. And usually people are grandfathered into a couple checklists depending on the way you're operating as a short line and how we set up your plans. If you have several people that you need to grandfather in, then I would suggest the other option inside RailTasker is you can upload a CSV, and you can upload checklist assignments, either assigning a checklist to somebody, or you can put a designated status there and grandfather everybody in at the same time. Again, Diane and I or Katie on the team is happy to help you with this. We just need to know who's grandfathered into what. You can also manage your instructors in this upload by saying the checklist ID, their username, and true false, and so you can add and remove instructors in bulk if you need to do that. Any questions on the RailTasker piece? I'm just going to jump back real quick. For those of you using RailTasker, if you get us this spreadsheet with your employees' names and who needs grandfathered and what, we can take it from there, or we can have another call and show you that again. Either way, whatever is easiest for you. And for those of you not using RailTasker, really, I think this spreadsheet is the template that Shortline Association put together with a variation, and that certainly can work for grandfathering in or designating employees. RailTasker is going to automatically track who the instructor is in the reporting side once you assign those, and I can show that for those of you curious about what that looks like. Let's just see here. Actually, on our top level report, it has the designated instructor name and the checklist name, the date it was signed off. It will have that at the top level. I'm just looking through here. If you need to have more details, this would be above and beyond the training requirements. But you do have every task that was signed off, who signed it off, and whether or not they were an instructor. Certainly a qualified person can be the one signing it off, and then in that case it would have a no. And at the top it would show who did the final sign off. It's not the best example, but for the purposes of record keeping, just how that works. For those of you, anyone using paper out there, just make sure you have this top information of the date it was finally marked up. This is the thing right now with 243 with, I say markup because we're used to that with conductors and engineers, but the qualification date, and then who was the person that deemed that person qualified as the instructor. So make sure you have that in your paperwork. And so for me, those were the two things really I just wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page. 243 is a big topic. I might have saw a couple of you in Kansas City. Hopefully I'll see a few of you in Louisville next week. We'll be talking about 243 again then, but I'm happy to take any questions if there's any. There's definitely some things coming up with 217 as well that I could talk about. I will mention the 217 piece. For those of you that are using your 217 operations testing or efficiency testing programs to be compliant with the oversight requirements in 243, the periodic oversight, mostly railroads. For contractors, that they would just need to do the periodic oversight. A couple things to note. One is that 217 has a 1-year record keeping requirement, and the periodic oversight in 243 has a 3-year record keeping requirement. Just make sure you are using the keeping records for a minimum of 3 years. I do have slides somewhere on this stuff, but I'm just going to talk to it. The other thing is that periodic oversight is really limited in scope for 243. Conductors and engineers are exempt because they're covered elsewhere. But that said, you're really talking about Part 214, Part 220, and Part 218. Now, the difference is with with operations tests, there was generally specific tests completed with inside those CFR parts. For example, handling switches and derails needed to be included in your operations testing program. Now with 243, FRA will expect operations tests on 218 in its entirety as it applies to your operations. Make sure there's blue signal, tampering with a safety device, and so forth. The same thing with Part 214. Chances are you have operations tests on track safety and RWP, but now if you're using it for periodic oversight, you may need additional tests on things like bridge worker safety and Subpart D, the roadway maintenance machine standards. Just a couple notes on that because there's some nuances there that I think didn't stand out to any of us until more recently. I really just wanted to make sure everybody had the next steps for 243 as far as instructors and grandfathering people in. I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you all.